What's going on, everybody? Anthony Cervino here on the RotoWire Fantasy Football YouTube channel with my 5 must-start players for NFL Week 10. We're going to start with Tyreek Hill. And yes, he's a must-start player this week, despite the fact he has been less than productive this season. Now, I get it. Tua did return in Week 8. But in the 2 games with Tua back, Tyreek Hill has given us 12 and 13.2 PPR points. That is not what we drafted Tyreek Hill in the top 3 for going into the fantasy season. We drafted Tyreek Hill for his normal high ceiling. Now, the targets, at least in Week 8, were there. He had 9 of them. Grabbed 6 for 72 yards. Last week was a little bit of an issue. He was only targeted 5 times. In fact, he was out-targeted by Devin Achane and Jonnu Smith, but he did catch 4 for 80, so we know he still has that big play capability. What's missing here is the touchdowns. He has not scored since Week 1. But I think we get the complete game from Tyreek Hill this week against the Los Angeles Rams. The Los Angeles Rams, they are a team that can be beaten by the big play wide receiver. We've seen it happen all season long. Now, the Rams this season, they are 20th when it comes to fantasy points conceded to the wide receiver position, giving up 34.1 PPR points per game. Now, the NFL average in the last 3 weeks is 30.8. That is a number that the average NFL team is giving up in PPR to wide receivers. Well, the Rams in the past 3 weeks, they're giving up 35.1 PPR points per game to wideouts, which is a plus 14% differential. Now, was that inflated a little bit by JSN's 37 last week? Yes, but we also saw Tyler Lockett score and go for 15.3 PPR points. The week before that, without a touchdown, Justin Jefferson goes for 19.5 on 8 of 9 targets for 115 yards. Now, in the middle of the season, it looked like the Rams were tightening up their secondary. They were smashed by Jameson Williams, Marvin Harrison, and Juwan Jennings. They all went for over 24 fantasy points apiece. So we know that the wide receiver position can get to the Rams, and I think we see the reemergence of Tyreek Hill in Week 10. Let's go to my next must-start, Deebo Samuel. Now, I do need to say, Deebo Samuel, he's dealing with the oblique injury. So far, he's limited in practice this week, but we do expect Deebo Samuel to play. But if he doesn't, we're, of course, going to have to pivot. But let's assume Deebo Samuel plays. We know he's been erratic from a fantasy football perspective. He's been dealing with some injuries, sickness. And when he has played, he's only given us 3 games with over 18 PPR points. The rest, he's gone under 12. Coming out of the bye, Deebo, he's a little bit rested. We're expecting him to be a little bit healthier. And now he gets the dream matchup. Now, before we get into the matchup, we know there is no more Brandon Ayuk. We also expect not only Jordan Mason, but CMC to also return. George Kittle's have an outstanding season. We might see Juwan Jennings for the first time in a long time. We might see the full deck of San Francisco 49ers skill position players minus Ayuk on display. And we know that enemy defenses have a hard time stopping them when they're all healthy. That just means that we're going to maybe see fewer touches, but more efficiency, which was the name of the game for the 49ers last season. Deebo gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, and we know this Tampa Bay defense, they are getting worse by the week. You can run on them, but you can especially throw on this football team. In the last 3 games, or the last 5 games, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are giving up an average of 43.9 PPR points to enemy wide receivers. The NFL average in that 5-game time period is 32.5. That is a plus 35.4% differential. we've seen players like Rashad Bateman, Darnell Mooney, DeAndre Hopkins all go for over 20 PPR points on this Tampa Bay secondary in the past 3 games. We could even go back to week 5 when they played the Falcons in Atlanta. That game, the wide receiver position went nuts. London and Mooney both went for 30. We also seen Kadero Hodge and Ray McLeod both score over 12. I would say the 49ers offense, at their best, should be, in theory, better than the Falcons. I'm expecting Deebo Samuel for the first time this season to go ballistic this week. Remember, if you like content like this, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and the alert icon so you can be notified anytime we go live to answer your questions or when we drop content like this. If you have fantasy football, start sit questions, trade questions, waiver wire questions, ask them in the comments below. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. Let's go to George Pickens. He's another must-start player for me. In 2 games with Russell Wilson, we are starting to see the very best of George Pickens. Remember that first game in Week 7 against the Jets, he goes off for 22.1 PPR points, 111 yards receiving, and a touchdown on 9 targets. Let's scale it back to the last time we saw George Pickens on the field against the Giants, 2 weeks ago before the bye week. Pickens had an average day. 5 targets, catching 4 for 74, only 11.4 PPR points. But if you remember watching that game, there were multiple big plays and at least 1 touchdown called back. George Pickens should have went for another 20 PPR points, but the scoring and the yardage were called back. But if we look at the way this offense is playing with Russ, with the way Russ is trusting George Pickens to go get the contested catch and come down with it. And we know George Pickens is a playmaker waiting to happen anytime he catches the ball. He's being targeted on 25.7% of his routes using the metrics on RotoWire.com, which is 90th percentile. He's also getting a monstrous 28.2% of his team targets, and he's averaging 91.5 air yards per game. And guess what, folks? They traded for Mike Williams. And that is a good thing because it's no longer just the George Pickens show. We know Mike Williams, when healthy, is an excellent receiver, and that's just another weapon. That's just another threat that the enemy defense has to pay attention to, which means we could see more one-on-one opportunities for George Pickens, which means he can go off. And Pickens this week, he gets the Washington Commanders. Now, their defense is getting better on a week-to-week basis under Dan Quinn, which we should expect. But this is still a secondary. Let's face it. The good offenses, the good quarterbacks, the good receivers, they're going to find a way to get going. And in the past few games, by the way, they shut down the Panthers. They shut down the Bears. They allowed Neighbors. They held him to 14.9. But these aren't great offenses, especially throwing the football right now. If we go back to earlier this season, we've seen guys like Chase, Evans, Neighbors. They all went off on this secondary. And I think the same can happen this week with George Pickens. Let's go to George Kittle, my must-start tight end. And Kittle, we are seeing consistency out of George Kittle. For the first time in a long time, maybe ever, he's a reliable fantasy asset on a week-to-week basis. Every game since week 2, George Kittle has given us at least 14 PPR points. He's also had 4 games over 20 PPR points. He's also scored a touchdown in all but 1 game since week 2. He's also seeing at least 7 targets in all but 2 games since week 2. He's getting the volume. He's being targeted on 20.8% of the team targets and on 25.5% of the routes he is running with an 81.6% catch rate. George Kittle has been absolutely money and relatively healthy this season. And I think he takes this momentum. And you guessed it, we just talked about it earlier before with Deebo. This is a great matchup with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. As bad as, sometimes we see teams, they might be good against receivers, bad against tight ends. Good against tight ends, bad against receivers. Well, guess what? The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they can't stop anything in the passing attack. They are one of the worst teams at defending fantasy wide receivers. They're just as bad at limiting fantasy tight ends. In fact, they might be worse against the tight end position. In 5 out of the past 7 games, we've seen 5 tight ends, Goddard, Pitts, Andrews, Pitts, Kelsey, all go for at least 16 PPR points, 4 of them over 19. And in 3 straight games, we've seen a tight end go for over 22 PPR points. This is a great spot for George Kittle to go ballistic. We're going to close off with Tyrone Tracy. He's my must-start running back of the week. He gets a terrific matchup against the Carolina Panthers, the dream matchup. In 2 out of the past 5 games since Tyrone Tracy has taken over this backfield, we've seen him go for over 22 fantasy points. He's going for over 129 yards in 2 games. He has scored a touchdown in 2 of those games. He is averaging 11.8 touches per game right now, but since taking over, he is seeing well over 16 touches per game. I'm all in on Tyrone Tracy. We know that Daniel Jones, when he's not getting that protection, and he's not, since Andrew Thomas is done for the year, they're going to have to rely on Tyrone Tracy to run this offense. They're going to have to rely on running the football to potentially open things up for the passing attack, which has quieted down of late, despite the fact we are seeing Malik Neighbors getting targets. Tyrone Tracy, he gets the best matchup he has seen all season long since taking over as the lead back. This Carolina Panthers defense, they cannot stop anybody on the ground. They are easily the worst football team in the NFL right now when it comes to fantasy points allowed to enemy running backs in the past 5 games. The average NFL team is giving up 22.9 points per game to running backs. Carolina's at 31.5, which is a plus 37.2% differential. We've seen 5 different running backs pop for over 20 PPR points in this matchup. We've seen Kamara do it last week. Kamara went for over 200 total yards and didn't even score a touchdown and still managed 27.5 PPR points. I think we see the best game of Tyrone Tracy's young career in Week 10.